My name is Harif. I'll be the chair for today. This is a 5-judge panel. The following judges are Hana, Sarah, Hilmi, Danish. So pronouns are he, him. Before beginning your speech, you are given time to state your preferred gender pronouns and your preferred method of BOI. I will be doing my best to time you from 1, 6, 7, and 7:15. 7:15, I will raise my arms to indicate that I am no longer taking notes. And before we begin, please do make it easier for ballots. Type your speaker roles in chat. All right, while you're doing that, we can move on to Prime Minister. Please welcome. The floor is yours.
I prefer verbal POI, and I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. When youth died at the hands of police during the Iranian protests, we believe that this is tragedy. But understand that in today's debate, we believe that youth have an obligation to fight against to fight within social movements and fight for the causes that affects them in the end of the day. So right now, youth, they are involved in climate strike, like the Fridays for Future that was initiated. A strike that was initiated by Greta Thunberg, a youth herself. And another example of youth-led movement fighting for the youth is the Undi 18, in which these movements are led by youth fighting for the electoral participation of the youth. And we believe that the youth within society have an obligation to involve themselves within these social activism and especially policy making through involving themselves in the voting system as well as in the parliament itself. Now, moving on to my argument, there are two arguments regarding self-preservation and self-defense, and the second argument is regarding democratic participation. Right. On the first argument, no thank you. And the first argument regarding self-preservation and self-defense, we believe that everyone has the duty to have of self-preservation and self-defense. That means that they have to preserve their safety, and they need to themselves from any harm. And we believe that this principle and the principle of self-preservation, like preserving your safety itself, is the underlying principle behind self-defense. Like you need to defend yourself because you need to preserve your safety, your well-being, and things like that. And we believe that this. When you are harmed, for example, like you are shot, when you are being shot, I say perhaps that you are in a shooting or something, and someone is actively trying to harm you, you need to stand up for yourself and you need to protect yourself against those harm. And this an application of this principle is like during the Iranian protests, the Iranian social policies like the mandatory hijab and things like that. We believe that when people protest against that and fight against the regime that is imposing those social policies, no thank you. We believe that this is an act of self-defense. We believe that they are defending themselves against the harm that was caused by morality police violence, and we believe that they have an obligation to fight against these policies. And not only that, we believe that this duty of self-preservation is also applicable to like environmental activism, in which people fight against like pollution and climate change that destroys their future, right? So when they are living in an unsafe future, and when they are living in an uncertain economy ravaged by a damaged environment, we believe that this is when their safety is at stake and is threatened. And we believe that they should fight against the policies that are maintaining like the environmental degradation in order to achieve a safe future. And why should they look out for themselves? Like, why shouldn't other people look out for themselves? Like the adults, the ones who are actually committing these violent social policies, as well as those damaging environmental policies. Why should they look out for themselves?
Right.
We believe that they should look out for themselves, because understand that we believe that no one else is really looking for them, because they are like, for example, like those politicians, they do not really care about the youth and the future. The youth have an obligation to look out for themselves, because no one else is really looking out for them. Yes, before I continue further,
There seems
yes.
to be a point as to why is it is beneficial for the youth to be take part in things such as social movements, right? However, what is your yardstick to determine the obligation towards these youth in order for them to be empowered?
Can you rephrase that question?
What is your metric to determine what is equal to an obligation towards the youth to be?
I've answered that later in my argument. So, and moving on, and we believe that not only not only should they look out for themselves, but we believe that in terms of like the practical level, when they fight for these issues that they are really that really affects them, this is when we have people that are really motivated to fight for change, right? But like, for example, they are affected by climate change, that are disproportionately affected by climate change. If they do not fight for it, the environment is going to get worse and worse. So they are really motivated, as opposed to those people who benefit from who benefit from like environmental degradation, or who won't be around to actually perceive or be affected by the worsening future. So we believe that in terms of practical level, we have a better better solution to this problem, this climate problem, because these people are really motivated, and because these people are really motivated for to fight for social change. And we believe that and moving on to my second argument regarding like democratic participation, we believe that everyone living in the democracy is affected by the country's policies, and as a result, everyone must have a say to it. That means that they must be able to vote for it, and not only that, they must be able to make those policies, be involved in the policy making process itself, because they are affected by it. So we believe that the youth should support like movements fighting for the right to vote, for example, like Undi 18, because they are affected by policies, economic policies, like social policies and things like that. So they should be involved in those policies, and they should fight for their involvement. And to really nail down the point here, we believe that this is true because no one else is really looking out for them, and they don't really care. So as a result, like because they really care about themselves, they should look up. They should fight for these rights that are to them, basically. And we believe that as a result, like this improves democracy as a whole, because when people participate, especially the youth participate in the democracy, this is when we are going to have better policies, because we include multiple, like various other people within the society in the decision-making process. And we believe that because of the reasons stated, I'm proud to propose.
Thank you, PM. Now to open the case on the opposition side, LOOO.
Yep, just want to check my light and clear. Yeah, timer. I'll be starting my speech soon. This debate is about the youth who are not affected by these his social activism movements. This debate is not about African American kids not wanting to fight for their own safety because you have an obligation. Because of course they have an obligation to fight for their own safety, but rather this debate concerns the majority of people who are of youth who are currently protected by institutions who don't want to go against their own safety net. And for those reasons, we don't think that they have an obligation to participate in this social activism. So, a few points of characterization. First of all, I just want to talk about like the ability of youth to even like pursue all this social change in the first place, because recognize that there are a lot of structural barriers that exist. Because the thing is that the fact that these structural barriers involve things like maybe their parents that giving them a place to stay, like paying for like their school, their food, and so forth. The fact that these youth aren't able to do so on their own means that they have to follow these parents, which becomes like a hurdle when they want to like actively fight for like social movements. Because the thing is that in most scenarios, the place where this debate should take place is in a place where social activism is needed, where it is actively required. For example, like in conservative societies. For example, if you're in Saudi Arabia, you might be fighting for women's rights. We see that in those societies, it's of course very likely that let's say your own family might not agree with you, and let's say you might even be kicked out of your own institutions. We think that those are harms that come with social activism, which is why you shouldn't be obligated in order to pursue these social activism movements in the first place. Because at the point at which you don't have the ability to help out with these social activism movements, or where you're actively harmed by it, you shouldn't have an obligation to do so. Because recognize that government side cannot change the narrative that like even if this motion were to pass, where youth suddenly have an obligation, youth wouldn't like suddenly like rise up all of a sudden to try to fight for social change, because of the fact that like these structural barriers will all still exist. And there's also like narratives or notions where people believe in things like, oh, how youth are incompetent or how they can't do certain things. So that means that youth still won't have much power. They won't have much power, and they won't have a lot of ability in order to actually do these things in the first place. So second point of characterization. Look, I want to talk more about like, why is it that youth have no recognize that their power is like the power or the way that they're able to continue living is derived from other places, like that being your money or home is by parents, and like your education that you want to have in order to pursue things like jobs is made by you have to go to like schools and so forth. Because the thing is that even if these youth agree with these social activism movements, the thing is that they cannot like go against the safety net that they are born with. The fact that youth, they don't have the ability to fend for themselves, which is something that I think is very harmful. At the point at which you think that they have an obligation to actively go against the people who are protecting them. So you can't exactly bite the feeding hand that they have. So another thing that I want to talk about is that it's about just a bit of characterization, because like this debate isn't taking place in like your liberal like / stable societies. There is not a need for social movements in such a place, because we think that this debate should take place in a place where like you actually need activism. Like I said just now, like Arab with women rights, the thing is that like you could have structural barriers, like how your family might not agree, the fact that you could be shunned by society. These are all things that are extreme to youth, and especially the fact that youth are under 18 and the fact that they don't have a way to fend for themselves and so forth. So moving on to rebuttals. First of all, it's on the previous speaker's point of how you have like this obligation to do like self-defense. Look, we don't think that this is relevant, because I don't think that this is part of the debate, because like we're not talking about the people who are being like actively punched down, because the world that opposition is fighting for is not a world where people like don't fight back for themselves, because we're talking about a world where youth who are already living a comfortable life, they have to go against safety net in order to actually go out and do social activism, to go out and campaign. So we're not talking about the people who are actively being harmed, because talking about the youth who are like protected by institutions, by parents and so forth. And second rebuttal is about how he wants to talk about how it's more likely that your movements are more likely to succeed. Look, recognize that number one, this is not a policy debate, so we don't think that this is a very important point. And second, even if you do think so, recognize that just because this motion could pass, it doesn't mean that youth could suddenly rise up. Because just because the youth has an obligation, that doesn't suddenly magically erase like every structural barrier that they have preventing them from doing so, or the fact that they even should have an obligation in the first place, which I'll be touching on in my argument. So moving on to my first argument, it's on the principle of obligation. There are several premises that this argument stands on. The first is, just because you have the ability, which we think is the best case scenario for government, of course, that doesn't mean that you actually have to use that ability. Because just because you might see, like, let's say you see a man drowning in an ocean, if you want to jump down to save him, you might drown as well. So the point is, that why should you, at the point at which you harm yourself, you shouldn't have an obligation in order to help that person. It's the second premise. Why is it likely that you harm yourself in the act of pursuing such obligations is because of the fact that you as a youth don't have that much power for yourself. You are controlled by outer forces like structural barriers. This incentivizes things like change in the structures that you live in. At the point at which you are unable to actively like support these movements without harming yourself, we don't think that you have an obligation, especially when they're at such a vulnerable point at their lives. So third premise is how is unlikely for you to actually even be able to get change in the first place. It's because like, why should you be obligated to do something that you're not able to do so? The thing is that youth, there are a lot of notions, narratives against them. The fact that people think that they are unable to like fend for themselves, people think that they are incompetent. These are all things that make people like not actually like care about like what the youth are saying. This means that what the youth are trying to do oftentimes have like lesser impact, and it's unlikely for them to succeed. So the second argument is on the principle of like social activism. Look, social activism is there to solve a problem. Now I just want to look at like who actually in the first place. First premise. Look, the people who actually cause these problems in the first place are people like your older generations. The fact that you have things like structural racism, or you have things like patriarchal society, these are all things that are formed by the older generation. Therefore, why should the burden then fall onto the youth in order to clean up other people's mess? We don't think that this is something that is morally right, because of the fact that the youth did not do it in the first place, and now suddenly they have an obligation in order to do so. We don't think that is something that is entirely just in the first place. So what are the impacts of this? The impacts of this is that when you shift like this narrative, or when you like try to say that youth have an obligation to do those things, we say that you are shifting the blame and burden away from the people who actually do so, which we don't think is exactly the ones fixing their own mess. For all those reasons, side with opening government.
Thank you, LO. Now I'd like to invite DPM OG.
All right, so I'll be starting my speech in, sorry, can you give me a second? All right, so I'll start my speech in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Just because you are affected by something doesn't mean that you have to commit it. This is the main point given by the opposition side for today's debate. And my main point for today, my main purpose here today is to prove that point wrong and why side opening government would win this debate. And so before that, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My pronouns are he, him, and you can just unmute your mic. So moving on to my rebuttals. So a point given by the LO is that the youth wouldn't suddenly fight for their causes just because they have the ability to fight for these causes. They wouldn't actually fight for it. And our response to that is that we concede to the fact, even if the best case scenario in our case was that they were given the ability to fight for it, you need to understand that it's going to give them an urgency to combat these things that are going to affect their lives. For example, climate change, for example, being a part of democracy, being a part of society affected by the democracy. And I'll explain that further on in my speech. And the next point given by the LO is that he has stated that these millennials, the youth don't have very much power in today's world, in today's society. And our response to this is that an example I would like to give is that the Iranian protests done were mostly by women. And I would like to state a fact that mostly the people who are involved in these protests are actually the youth who are very radical and are going to do something to prove their point that they need to fight for their rights in Iran. And moving on to my next rebuttal, the leader of opposition also has stated that no, thank you. They have also stated that these youth are already living a comfortable life. They are already protected by the older generations. And also another point given by him is that why would the burden be put on the youth if the choices that burdens them are made by the older generation? And our side's response to this is that these youth, why they have an obligation to actually be involved in this activism, social activism or environmental activism, is that because they are a part of humans. They are affected by the things that the choices were made by the older generation. No, thank you. For example, climate change, even though it's the older generation that actually, for example, does deforestation and also pollution, these millennials or the youth are actually also affected by it. And that's why they have an urgency. They are obligated to combat against these problems because they need to fight for their own, they need to fend for themselves in today's world. And last but not least, no, thank you. And last but not least, I'd like to say that our main point for today is that these youth are going to be affected by various problems such as climate change and also the parliament not having any youth involved in it, and they are going to be affected, and so they have an obligation to combat it. That's why they need to get involved in this social and environmental activism. So moving on to my one and only argument in today's debate. So yes.
Is the narrative you're defending the idea that youth has to be in the forefront of all social movements, or are you defending the idea that the youth can form the bargaining power to as well?
Thank you for that, POI, and I'll explain that later in my speech. Okay, so moving on to my argument. So why is involvement in this social activism good, especially for the youth? So you need to understand that the end goal here for today is that we're going to bring forth a generation of informed youth. We are going to improve this activism. If we are going to solve these problems for the youth and going to improve the system, for example, the democracy system. And so moving on to my explanation. So you need to understand that these youth, these people are going to be affected by democracy, the democratical policies that are passed for the parliament, and they're going to be affected by it. And just like I said before, they're going to be affected by, for example, climate change. And therefore, they are obliged to involve themselves in this, for example, parliament and also these movements to combat that problem itself. And for example, the Iranian protests, just like I stated before, most of the people who are protesting in Iran right now are mostly the youth. They are going to do demonstrations in that protest in order to prove their point and stand out to solve that problem itself. No, thank you. And you need to understand that through this, we are going to bring forth a generation of informed people, of informed youth. They would, for example, in democracy, they are going to understand that they are going to be affected by the democracy itself. And if a policy were to pass, they would involve themselves in this democratic system, for example, in the parliament, and they are going to find ways to solve that problem. For example, they are going to find a solution for the politician to take in order to solve the problem in their status quo. And understand that these youth would be informed, and that means they would know what's coming for them. They would know what's the problem in their status quo, what's going to affect them, and know what they have to fight for. An example I like to give is that they're going to improve the democratic system. No, thank you. And they're going to have more involvement from the youth, and it's going to be more fair towards the society as a whole. And last but not least, I'd like to make a comparison between both sides. In our side, we are going to, just like I stated before, going to bring forth a new generation of informed youth where they're going to know what problems they are facing in the current world and going to find ways to solve it. Meanwhile, on opposition, if they would, no thank you, the time's up. And even if opposition has stated that more time, they have better things to do, such as study, we are going to tell them that in their world, it's going to put a lot more suffering on the youth when the older generation is gone, when it's the youth's time to take over the world and when their time to rule. And with that, I'd like to...
Thank you, DPM. Now I'd like to welcome DLOOO here.
Hi, am I audible? Am I visible?
Yes to both.
Okay. Yeah, I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. When my first speaker told you that when people don't have the ability to do so, they're not obligated to help, right? We're not talking about just because they'll not get anything back or the backlash from them. Because when they actually help, they will get negative repercussion. The fact that the institution will push them away because they're trying to be different, right? That is the debate, right? So before I move on, a few points of recharacterizations. The first, this debate isn't about the benefits of being obligated. We think this debate is a question whether youth have the obligation to involve in policy making and social activism. Now, a few responses towards the speaker before me. Firstly, is a response against the idea of self-defense, which is something that OG likes to talk about. Now, the people we're talking about in this debate, the current stakeholder, is not the people who are getting beat up most of the time. People are being bullied by the institution. We think these are the people who have the ability to actually do something and to actually help these people. Self-defense is not really relevant in this debate because people who are harmed naturally have an obligation to defend themselves because they are inclined to help and get changes for themselves. Therefore, what this debate concerns is the people, the average people who are not being abused and they have the ability to actually create social changes. Now, even if we want to talk about like the minorities, let's say the people who are getting affected, we think as a whole it's very dangerous for you to push the obligation for towards the youth, towards the youth minorities, because the idea of self-sacrifice with no purpose that doesn't achieve anything, it's simply a waste of life. Because even if it takes away their life, I think it's incredibly taxing for this youth, which is something I will explain later more in my argument. Now, secondly, let's talk about the policy that second speaker like to say. Now, so far, we haven't heard any single policy for youth. They told you about taxes, they told you about economical stuff, but they have never told us that the policy that affects the youth as a whole. Because so far we heard about taxes. We think these policies are being supported by their parents. And even if there was a problem with this policy, we think currently there are already people who are wanting to fight for a better policy, right? Now, what we require from CG after this, or OG, CG, is what exactly are the policies that are affecting youth that causes this youth have to fight for the betterment of this betterment of the current structure, right? We think that this debate concerns the political problems, that is to say, the one that concerns conservative structure, in which the people living in that structure holds on to a religious belief and to a cultural belief. Things that requires a lot of problems, they require a lot of changes, that is breaking down the structure barriers, which two reasons. First, it's very, very hard and it's very taxing. It's almost impossible for the youth to actually create any change. Secondly, it's something that community hold on to, and in fact, it will then make these individuals being shunned by the society. We think even then, even if they are able to help, we think their ability to help is very minimal at best, because it's something that my first perspective that perceive youth are as incompetent and they have no say in the current political talk right now. Third response is about just because you have more obligation, it doesn't change the fact that youth don't have the power to actually do anything. It does not mean that just because suddenly you pass this motion in the parliament, then people will rally up and be supportive. This debate concerns a world where there exists social problem and there is a need for social activism. That means that it concerns the world where there exists conservative structure. Unfortunately, youth cannot do anything about it, because even if they want to take an example of Greta Thunberg, the reason why Greta Thunberg was able to be successful because first of all, three reasons: because the people supported her. Secondly, she was very famous. She instantly get support. Thirdly, because she lived in a liberal society where people are more open-minded. When we talk about conservative structure, when we talk about conservative country, we think that in this world, people are not going to be supportive. Your parents are not going to support, and you're going to lose the net support. You're going to lose the net support that is very harmful and very damaging towards this youth, right? Now, before I am my speech, let's talk about my argumentation. First, we think that the reason why youth shouldn't be obligated is because they will get negative repercussion. The pragmatic reasons why it's not possible for the youth to fight for social changes is because for a few layers of analysis. The first, existence of structural barriers. That is, the powerful narrative that dictates children as incompetent, no say in the political world. A good example is, let's say if I'm a guy in Malaysia, or if I'm a children in Malaysia, and I talk about feminism and LGBT rights, the impacts then is that people are going to shun me, that I'm going to be pushed away by my institution institution and the people. That my friend will all bully me, and I will lose all of my friends. And because their reason is because I'm trying to be different and I'm not following the cultural belief and the religious beliefs that happen in the country. These structural barriers, these two impacts, then it disable me to fight for the social justice to a full extent, and it incentivize youth to join in the policy making or social activism. What happened in opposition world? We think that in opposition world, it's very damaging for this youth, because first you lose your safety net. That is to say, you will be harmed by your own institution. That the fact that you will be shunned away and people are going to hate on you. We think at the point, even if like you want to say, oh, when more people supportive and it's going to somehow create changes. We think at the point in which your parents, the institution, and the current structure refuse to support you or refuse to support your ideology, at the end of the day, the fight for support, the fight for changes is very hard, and it's quite almost impossible for this youth to begin with. Now, let's talk about my second argumentation, how it will affect their life. Now, we're talking about youth. Youth are people who are just starting to begin their life. They are people who are under 18. Now, these people there are people who are currently studying at school, they're currently studying at university, they're trying to take education. At the point in which you force the obligation for this youth to become a social activist, because you have to understand, the youth are not going to become a social activist for 24/7. If you want to say, oh, Greta Thunberg was able to do so, Greta Thunberg was very popular and she's able to spearhead that movement. This is not something that majority of the youth are able to do so. Therefore, if you want to say that if people are able to become like Greta Thunberg, it's very unlikely, because these are your normal average people, your average individual who don't have as much popularity, who don't have much influence in the current world. Secondly, because they live because of the fact that they live in a conservative structure which disable their ability to actually fight for changes. Now, why is it harmful? Because first of all, it's incredibly taxing for this individual. You are taking away their life, because you're taking away their life, the fact that they have more to do later on in their life. We think it's very harmful. What I've told you so far, we think this debate, throughout this whole debate, what side of opposition has done so far, we've proven to you why it's not the obligation for the youth to fight for social changes. Secondly, because of how you get negative repercussion. Unless side of opposition, why they should fight for these changes, because in fact of this negative repercussion still happen, then you have to prove that in its closing government. If that in mind, I would like.
All right, thank you, dear. I'd like to welcome MGCG.
Hello, hello. Am I audible?
Okay.
All right. So I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Educators realize what exactly the youth today are. They are progressive individuals. They are people that can actually fight for change. They have the idea of changing the world for the better, to make sure the world is better than it is right now for the next generation. So firstly, how exactly are we going to differentiate ourselves with opening government? Firstly, we're going to explain to you how exactly this obligation happens in the first place. Secondly, we're going to give you even more impacts based on the argument I will give to you, more analysis on this argument. Fourthly, we're also going to be giving you new layers of responses towards the previous speakers, and also we're going to give you an extra characterization on today's debate. So let's sort it all out first. Firstly, extra characterization in today's debate. What exactly would youth in policymaking and social activism look like? We say that youth can either be the head of it or can support of it. We can have it either way, because in our world, what we want is a world where the youth can actually go out and are obligated to go out and make sure their messages are spread, their liberal messages are spread. This would look like a world where more Greta Thunbergs would happen, a world where where the youth can go out and spread their message, maybe either even through social media, either through protest, or even through protesting. And we say they can actually able to fight for change, because they are able through this policy making, through this social activism. They have voices in parliament, they have voices in policy making, and they are actually involved, and are actively involved in social activism. So nextly, to rebuttals towards the leader of opposition. What he talked about, and also the deputy leader of opposition talked about, is about the structural barriers that the youth face nowadays,
Right.
how they are unable to do things on their own. And we said that I'll take one after this rebuttal, they are basically assuming that the youth are incapable of going out to protest. And sure, they have schools to worry about, sure, they have their studies to worry about. Realize under our characterization, we already told you that the youth can easily spread the message online. They can also go out to protest if they have the time for it. And we say that all these ways of protesting are ways of social activism, so that they can actually have voices in parliament. They are able to push through the structural barriers that they face. And also they talked about how exactly a conservative society will push them back down. But before I move on to that rebuttal, I'll take that POI.
The reason why we don't have Saudi Arabia and Greater Thunderbird, because there exist structural barriers that prevent these people from participating in the social movement.
Realize it's already proven in the Iranian protests that things like where youth are getting more braver to protest against these people. So we say if we give them the obligation to actually fight for change, to fight for social activism and make sure they are actively involved in these things, we say that stuff like progressive change in even Saudi Arabia can still happen, because realize the youth are the next generation. And we say this also moving on to my towards the rebuttal responses towards the POI, we say that even in a conservative society like Saudi Arabia, still progression can happen through the youth if we actually give them the obligation to do so. Because on our side of the house, we actually help this. We make sure they believe in change. We actually make sure they can actually make change happen. Because we give them the obligation. And we say this is so important because it actually makes sure a progressive society is achieved. So next part of my speech is my own argument on how exactly this obligation happens, because we say that the youth are very progressive. Why exactly is this true? Two premises we have for you here. We see that first premise is that through mediums like social media, people are spreading their influence. And we say that this type of influence is mainly progressive ideas, mostly by liberal parties, because conservative parties like let's say the Republicans in America, they usually don't go on social media. They prefer a more physical way, because that is what a conservative party is. They don't really get used to technology in the first place, and because of this causes the liberal parties to take a major control in social media, where the youth are usually at. So because of that, the liberal parties are able to make sure that their influences are spread towards the youth. And second premise on how exactly the youth are more accepting of new ideas. Realize the youth are still able to accept new ideas because that is embedded into their mind. They are embedded to learn to accept new ideas. And we say because they have this open mind, because they are able to accept new ideas, they actually have the progressive ideas that are actually able to make a world that's more liberal, that's more progressive. But before I move on, sure.
How is this little progressive change proportional to the severe repercussion of losing your safety net and being thrown away of your house?
Realize that this is an over impacted on your side of the house, because we say, I've already told you that sure, people can go out and protest, people can make sure the messages are spread. Sure, there will be backlash, but realize the society that we try to create will of course be more beneficial in the long term. We say that once we create the society, once the society actually accepts this, we say that we will create a society that's much more beneficial towards the youth. And even in a conservative society, realize that the youth are going to take over at one day. And we say that because of this, we can actually make sure they have a more progressive society. They're actually able to improve the society for the better. So what exactly are the impacts of the argument? First impact, how exactly on our side of the house we are actually able to make the future world better. We say we make a world where everyone is accepted, where you can finally voice out your own opinions so that actual progression is achieved. Sure, there will be hiccups along the way. Sure, there will be the conservative society pushing the youth down, but still this is better than nowadays, better than the things happening nowadays. So why exactly is this so important? We say this is important because we are able to fight for basic principles. We are able on our side of the house to fight for the basic principles of happiness, so that you're actually justified, so that you're actually accepted in our society. And this will make a better world for ourselves in general. So second impact. So we say on our side of the house, we're actually able to make sure our messages are spread further. Because of the youth accepting of these new technologies like social media, we say that this makes sure their messages are even more spread out to society, and make sure society is able to accept these messages for the best, for the better. So why exactly is it so important? We make sure on our side of the house, when the youth actually have this obligation, we make sure their voices are actually heard by society. Are actually can convince the society what exactly they're actually fighting for. And we say once they gain the support, once they actually show the conservative society who they are messing with, we say that this actually can make progressive change for the better. So what exactly have I done in my speech today? Firstly, I've given you an extra characterization on today's debate. Secondly, I've given you an open argumentation. After that, I've given you my responses towards the previous speaker. And lastly, with that, I've never been prouder to propose. Thank you.
Thank you, MG. Now I'd like to invite MO, CEO.
Can you guys hear me?
Okay.
Okay. All right. I feel like I personally have a sense of political awareness, right? But I also feel like the position that I am in, coming from KOS, Bola who got TV in my classroom, right, obviously has something to do with it. And it's unfortunate that 90% of people our age doesn't have this privilege. But the problem here in this debate is, underside government, the other 90% who does not have this privilege are seen as unintelligent, irresponsible, and worthless, right? What has government said to keep their state to keep their case afloat? They brought up this analogy of if you're shot like with a gun, then you have to come back up and defend for yourself, right? But notice that open government understand that as a child, if you get out from that gunshot, you're most likely to just be shot again, right? As compared to our alternative, where there's like some people actually protecting you from these dangers in society. And this danger in society is a stigma against children being at the forefront of movement. Another thing that they've tried to claim is that progression only occurs under their side. They say that, oh, it only happens when children are at the forefront of these movements, right? We say that no, because there are alternatives to this, more like children actually being like being used as like bargaining power in politics, right? I say political movements that actually encourage youth without actually having them at the forefront of these movements. Another example is tried to protest in the past, right? Greta Thunberg, right? And then the protests in the past, how they've worked because of like children being at the forefront of it, and they brought like Greta Thunberg, and then opening opposition despite being on our sides, try to tackle this by saying that greater support comes down to other factors instead of just her youth. But we say that we're going to take that a bit further and just say that her support doesn't exist at all. We say that her position as a child is weaponized against climate change movements, and we say this is a scenario exaggerated and commonplace even more on the side of government. And another thing, one thing that we see very unfair in this debate is government's unfair characterization of obligation. Ladies and gentlemen, notice the obligation to be involved in this debate does not equal to support. It means that there is direct involvement of children, but even if it's that there's direct involvement of these children in these movements, right? On to my first argument, my first question in this debate: why is it that society is better off in status quo, assuming that this debate takes place in societies that needs progression or societies that need progression socially, where progression socially, right? The characterization that both opening teams have set, we say that the youth aren't really the main issue in societies at all. So we say that the youth aren't affected by policies as much because there's really nothing at stake for them anyways. We say that at most there is only school policies or education policies that affect these children at the end of the day. They're not affected directly by economic shift compared to the people who are the majority of the voter base, who are actually adults who are actually affected by these changes, right? We say that the only form of actual like effects they get from these economic shifts are the ones that trickle down from their parents. Well, in that case, obligation is no longer on the children, but it's actually on the parents for them to voice out their concerns. Compared to adults under our case, where they are directly affected by these policies, for example, inflation, cost of living, and all these burdens are held by adults, and progression only occurs when we protect those people. We say that let's say that society does require a societal change for children. We say that it still doesn't happen because the youth aren't taken seriously. But before that, sure, you're right.
when you talk about how only adults are affected by these policies, realize that children themselves are going to also be affected by these policies. So how exactly can progressive change actually happen on your side of the house?
We've already explained that this effect only happens when it trickles down from the parents, right? But let's assume that children are affected by these policies, which that society doesn't, that they say it doesn't happen because the youth aren't taken seriously, right? So that our counter mechanism to this is actually youth are used as bargaining power. For example, politicians are advocating for youth in like election campaigns and stuff, where we actually put the burden on adults to hold the responsibility to protect the youth at the end of the day, right? And my second question is why is it that side gov alienates those who have no social awareness, children who don't have any social awareness in this debate? I would like to press on the issue of obligation, because I feel like side government hasn't really given a definition of obligation that we see sufficient, right? He said if this debate was are the youth progressive or are the youth affected by policies, it will be a pretty touristic debate, right? It'll be pretty boring. I mean, I'd rather watch Mark Gila or Liverpool. Probably not Liverpool lah. It's pretty boring also. But this debate is deeper than that. It's actually about pushing the notion, and it's actually about pushing a notion in society, and does that notion bring change for the better? It's about if the youth involve themselves directly at the forefront of these movements, will that bring about societal change? And our side opposition says no, because first of all, the youth are not ripe enough to talk about these issues. Truth be told, the majority of youth are left in the dark about about politics and policies. Right? We said not all cities are like KL, not all schools are like SBPs. We said that the youth that choose not to identify with certain views under their side are seen as ignorant and alienated because of obligation. And at the end of the day, this obligation is ultimately a coercion, right? Omar will talk about that in his opening line. Pretty fancy that. Even if this obligation encourages youth to advocate for change, assuming that alienation doesn't somehow happen under their side, he said that in that case, there's no real incentive for change anyways. Because the obligation now turns this activism into something more of an involuntary action because of that bandwagon argument that they've tried to bring about. And we see that it just doesn't stand in this debate, right? We feel like state government doesn't really achieve the goals of anyone in this debate, and there's no really trade-off required, right? We've won this debate. Under that side, the youth are laughed at, progression doesn't occur, change does happen, but for the worse, and side opposition wins this debate. Thank you.
Thank you. I will now GovWeb CG here.
Am I audible? Hold on. Right. So I'll be beginning my speech in 3, 2, 1. I want you to imagine yourself as a teenager. You scroll through social media and then you find out about these social movements on Twitter or Instagram, and then you start to learn more about them. You become more political aware of what's around you. So this is what we're trying to fight for here. We're trying to fight and put the obligation to these teenagers, these youth to actually have the understanding and actually emphasize what the world is trying to fight for, what society is trying to fight for. They're trying to fight for equality, for a better world. So today, I, as government's whip, will put everyone in this debate into shape. Now, the main question of this debate, whose side proves that these youth does or does not have the obligation to create a better society, and why closing government takes the win on this debate? Now, moving on to like the replies to like this leader of opposition, about how like the ability of youth to participate, about how they are dependent or like they depend on their parents and everything, about how like they are not ready enough to take over and actually go and push for social activism. Well, realize that we link this with government's principle of like self-defense, about how these youth are actually, they have other mediums as well to actually advocate. They don't necessarily like have to go out of their homes and get kicked out by their parents to actually advocate. They can just send a tweet, because obligation does not only refer to you just going out to a protest to fight. Obligation is the meaning to have the feeling in you to actually support that. So you can just do it through other means as well, because nowadays there's other mediums such as Twitter, Instagram, for you to spread the awareness and actually fight for these social movements. And then the second thing is that what leader of opposition told us is that you don't necessarily, the principality of you don't have to use the ability to do so. Just because you have the power, well, you can't really do so. We say that, as if I want to quote, with great power comes great responsibility, is that we say that you're selfish to actually have the power and not use it. So this principle is very flawed. And if everyone in the world were to able to apply that principle, we say that the world will not be a great place, because it clearly harms the future, because now people won't actually do anything just because they don't want to. And then the next thing is that how you say that people nowadays are incompetent, like how society will view them, like not pay attention to them because they don't even matter. But realize that when you put this obligation to youth and they care, when you see like the majority of like the population of like the youth actually standing on the street to fight, you know that the things about that thing is actually pretty serious, and society will actually take them pretty seriously, because it's not just one kid like acting like they're drunk actually supporting this movement. You actually have a lot of them actually fighting for these social movements. And then the next thing is about how like the leader of opposition said you shouldn't clean up their past because it's the past fault. Well, let me just put an example for you. Your father spilled milk on the floor, and then you say that, oh, I shouldn't clean it up because it's my father's fault. Why would I have to clean up for something not I did, it's my father did? And then here's the problem. I'll take that later after my response to leader of opposition. So here's the problem with that thinking, you just leave it on the floor. You don't clean it up because you think that eventually your father will come and clean it up. And then eventually you will slip on that milk. Because why? Because you thought someone will clean it up. Well, clearly you will suffer in the long term. Okay, I'll take a few eye from you. Going once, going twice. Okay, I'll just move on. I don't have much time here. Okay, moving to the deputy leader of opposition, but how you say about negative repercussion, like how they like realize that, okay, when you're voicing out an opinion, you need to realize that you are putting yourself at risk. Even I'm here putting out my opinion, I'm putting myself at risk. And that you are assuming that that the world we live in is a world full of there are communities. I'll take that later. You didn't say the moment. Okay, I'll just continue. You assume that there is a world full of conservatives. There are communities, there are subreddits, there are places where these people, there are teenagers, there are like adults who actually like create a safe zone for these people. So you assume that there's actually no safe zone for these people. And then the second thing is about how you talk about self-sacrifice without purpose. Well, realize that these people are actually sacrificing for a purpose, and if they, even in the worst case scenario possible, is that somehow they magically die, is that their sacrifice will actually be a message to the world to show that, hey, the youths are actually taking this seriously, maybe we should too. And then I'll take that after the deputies replies. Okay, moving on to the next one is about how you say that it's very hard to break structural barriers. Well, I can relate that about how the youth just moving on to the next one about how you say about like how Greta Thunberg, you gave 3 analysis about how Greta Thunberg eventually got struck down, even though like he had like 3 good things going for her. Well, realize that Greta Thunberg is a single person. Imagine, in our world where you actually put this obligation to every youth, and now 1,000 Greta Thunbergs actually pushing for like climate change. Don't you think that 1,000 Greta Thunberg can actually make more difference than a single Greta Thunberg? And then the next thing about say is that how youths are just starting their lives, they're about to get a job, about to get a degree, doctor, and all that. Well, see, you like, okay, let's assume that I want to just focus on my career. I don't give a damn. I don't even focus on like the current world problems. Okay, fine. And then when I go to a doctor, these like past policies will haunt me back. It will go like shoot me back in the foot because I didn't take them seriously when I was young. And now the future have to really suffer. The policy that the world we are currently living will actually kill me. Yes.
In conservative structure, people hold on to structure, culture, and religious beliefs. So even if you send out a tweet, which is a very minimal case, you will still get extreme repercussion because it contradicts the.
Well, I told you before, like we agree, like there will be repercussion, but then again, there will also be safe zone for these people. You're not just putting yourself in the middle of the battlefield when you're like joining these things. You actually have safe zones. These safe zones are like communities that actually support you. Now moving on to like the next reply about the member of opposition, about how he says like these like policies not affect children, like inflation and all that, whatever, it's the adult's obligation. There's 2 things I would like to say about this. Okay, it affects your parents, okay? Now it also affects you. So in a sense, you also stated that the contradictory in this is that it also affects you. It affects your parents and now it affects you. So technically that does affect you in the end. And then the next thing is that the you will eventually grow up and you will be hit with even harder inflation than before. you will get much worse effect if you don't handle this now. And considering that the old people, like, they don't even care because eventually they won't be in this world anymore. You are the one who's going to suffer from their actions. And then the second one is that the youth are not well informed about this. Well, in my opening line, I've touched about the social media on how much it creates much influence that more people are actually joining the social movements. To conclude my speech, why did side-closing government should take the win and overall? It's because I've proved, like, my member of government prove the point as to and give actual proper and setup and analysis as to what we're trying to fight for. And then my member and I also, like, replied to all of opposition's cases, and with that, never been.
Thank you. Final speaker for the whole tournament.
Hello. I can be heard, right? Cool. All right. POIs verbally, I don't know, man. Okay, POIs verbally, if I don't respond, you can go to chat, but I doubt I'll check chat. Okay. Preferred? Oh, never mind. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. A notion is a social standard, a social stigma. A notion is the mechanism that defeats option. And essentially, a notion is not just a notion, but also a coercion. Essentially, there are a few things that we have to know in this debate. What does it mean? And what is the categorical difference between obligation and involvement? Note that an obligation means that the youth has to be the ones to be in the forefront of these things. Notice then that this notion being pushed, and this is not a policy debate, is talking about why the narrative should exist and why the narrative is good. Notice that the notion being pushed, that the youth has to be the one in the forefront, is something that we're going to say is harmful in this debate, and that's what a burden in this debate is. We can still have bargaining power consisting of people in the youth, but it's not necessary. But not necessarily they have to be in that power and be in the forefront in this scenario, ladies and gentlemen. That is the characterization that we have to note in this debate, ladies and gentlemen. In 2018, like Malaysia hari ini, Harsha ran a similar argument as what we want to achieve at the end of the day. So we're just going to go with that. Two issues that we're going to have to bring in this debate. Number one, progressivity and outcomes. And secondly, what is the best interest of all these individuals in this debate, right? Firstly, on progressivity and outcomes. This is what we must understand, and this is what we heard from the entire government bench here today. They wanted to talk about the involvement of individuals and how it gives a form of outcome. They mentioned things such as the Black Lives Matter movement and why making people in like parliament, like people like Syed Saddiq, is important, right? We tell you that notice it does that in like getting sort of change and progressivity and outcomes in this debate is not exclusive under your side. You can still have that as things that are like bargaining powers and collective bargaining power that we say is really good, right? The difference between their side and ours and the outcome that is terrible, right? Because it seals the deal for any other form of changes to happen. What do we mean by this? The moment at which you have someone in power or you have someone there, it basically tells people that that's already enough, that you don't have to no longer protest because you already got the change that you already want. These are things that are the same structural barriers that OO want to talk about and what we extended upon, but we say that not only is it structural barriers that is like going to be affected, but also the fact that people no longer trust these individuals, right? That the youth cannot do anything about it in the end. Let's take that Greta Thunberg example that all houses in debate has brought up, right? Notice that like while OO gave good reasons as to why like other factors are caused, right? Pa'an told you that there was no support to exist to begin with, that there was no spreading of the message to begin with. People only want drama, and the youth are the people who stir up that drama instead of listen to these things, right? If you go to Google and search environmentalists, right, the thing you're going to see is just old people, already dead people, or like Leonardo DiCaprio. So these are things that we say are totally like that show how the youth are people who don't essentially fight for any of the cause any sort of change in these sort of movements, and we say that that is then harmful, right? What are other things that we have talked about? What are the things that we heard in this debate, right? The entire idea about why is it the obligation and the milk analogy that like closing government talked about, right? Notice three responses to that. Number one, it is the fault of the father in and of itself, meaning to say that what Pa'an said, that is the fault of the adults in and of itself. And secondly, the father is going to be affected anyway. He's going to have to do it, like, clean the carpet. He's going to have to pay for all the things that are required to clean that carpet, ladies and gentlemen, right? And maybe like the father wanted to go get milk, then he like never returns, right? So these are things that we say are the categorical difference between like what we mean as the adults having power and we are going to be affected by these things that I want to talk about, right? And second thing is the best interest of all the youth, second class, right? All the best, what is in the best interest of all the youth in society, right? An told you that it's not about change, meaning that it's not really about change that much, right? Meaning that the adults are the ones that are going to be affected by economic policy and economic like economic ideas and policies, right? So, but even if we wanted to say that it is for change, it does not happen under your side. We told you that the Greta Thunberg example is a clear example as to why the youth can't be the ones to be in power and fight for change in and of itself, right? And even so, you want to say, even in their best case, there are two things here that we have to talk about. Number one, the idea of birth lotteries, right? That people are affected by things such as like when they were born and they are not be able to control it, right? Meaning that, for example, your ability to get a lot of money to pay for tuitions, you know, to get a scholarship, college, right? So these are things, maybe like, for example, where in businesses where everything involves luck, or maybe you don't look good enough for you to be Alin's like good boyfriend, right? So these are things that we want to say that are the barriers, not only structural barriers, but the natural barriers that affect individuals from being able to make a change even in the first place, right? And then like just to throw out the debate, an entire thing about the shooting analogy, right? And why is it that it's important for self-defense, right? Notice that if I were to go into a rugby match, these people are more likely to tackle me and break my bones instead of, no matter how much principally right I am, right, ladies and gentlemen? And you know, okay, where's a lot of rugby? So and secondly, as well, about the whole idea about involvement, then this is not what the debate is. This is not what debate is about. And like the second thing you want to respond towards the idea of like best interest of all youth, right, is because then change is no longer voluntary, or there is no more incentives for change. What does this look like? This looks like vandalism in like the BLM protests that happen, right? This looks like sending in black pictures onto Instagram to support BLM protests, right? Or even virtue signaling, where even in the worst case of where like say involvement is what the debate is about, right? We say virtue signaling is something that's terrible because it promotes ignorance, it promotes inaction, right? Where people don't do anything, they only hop on the bandwagon. Even in the most liberal society, ladies and gentlemen, this is something that happens, and the idea of being like the youth being obligated is not going to be helpful at the end of the day. Therefore, ladies and gentlemen, we've proved to you why is it that the government bench being infatuated with saying why is it that they want progressivity, they want outcomes, they want change, and they want to ensure that the youth being principally like on the road to fight for change and like self-defense, right? And note that like self-defense and the entire principle of self-defense, the moment it harms people is not good principles, right? You lose your legitimacy, you lose bargaining power, you lose your people, right? And maybe even in the involvement case, we can have another debate about that, ladies and gentlemen. Oh, never mind, it's in prelims round 2. So these are things that we say are prove as to why is it that the youth being obligated, or the notion that the youth has to be in the forefront, is something that's harmful. Ladies and gentlemen, to end this speech, in 2018, our seniors, Kuhan, Harif Fahmi, and Ariana Saiful, were able to champion this competition. I hope that in this debate, we could prove to you why we should take back that trophy and why we win this debate. We're never proud to oppose.
All right, thank you for the grand final.